Welcome to the Kansas City War Room, Warlords. On today's episode of the Strategicana Saga podcast, we are going to discuss building a warband for the first time, or possibly looking back at a warband you've not played in a long time. This is something I personally have struggled with, and only now really feel I have a basic handle on. If we have time today, I would like to also discuss building towards a tournament if we have some time. So for today's discussion, I have three of our local players back to share their thoughts on the topic. So first, I'd like to welcome back Charles Yaw. So welcome back to the Strategicana Saga podcast, Charles.
Oh, happy to be here, Brett.
Thank you. The second person coming back to the podcast is Luke Starnes. Welcome back, Luke.
Hello, hello.
And last but not least, I'd like to welcome back to the podcast Stephen Holdeman III.
Hey there. Always glad to be here.
Thank you. So as we jump into this topic, we'll most likely cover a more competitive build as we kind of get through today. But I want to try to start with questions geared towards setting units that work with the board. So kind of thinking about the idea of like the first time I grab a board and I'm interested in a warband, how do I go about the idea of like matching abilities on the board with kind of unit compositions? And so that's what kind of leads me into the first question for you guys. So with that in mind, when looking for a new warband, how do you choose which warband to start with? So do you kind of like certain abilities? And this maybe doesn't have to speak to your personal style, but just kind of understanding when I first pick up a board, where do I even start? Where do I begin?
So I always look for at least one good mass activation. And if a board doesn't have one, like there's a real good chance I just won't play it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because like just getting more than one thing done with a dice is so important for tempo.
Mm-hmm. So really kind of jumping in with the mass activation is something for you that you're personally looking for. But if it doesn't have it, and this is where I guess I kind of come back to that too, is when you kind of get that new warband, I'm thinking about some of the other ways or like the abilities or choosing units. Kind of what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I might jump in and say that, first of all, you have to decide why did you arrive at this warband in the first place? And part of that is just talking about warband selection in general. There's a lot of reasons that people show up to play Saga, but usually they have some historical love or faction that they really admire, or they just like the gameplay elements because they've played some other games before, or they like the camaraderie just in general. And so that kind of puts you into three different categories, sort of. You've got the group that might initially just want to pick whatever faction is the most historically exciting for them a little bit, and then they might build their list a certain way, and they're going to reach their satisfaction in a certain way. And then finally, we're next. You got the game mechanic guys that again flipping through. They might not care so much about the models or historical drapings of the abilities that they're looking at on these different boards, but they might see something kind of like Luke here in this case, even though we all float in between these, where you say, I'm looking for a mechanic. I have fun with this game. This game has fun mechanics. And so when I go looking for a board, I want something that has an interesting mechanic that's going to keep me satisfied. And then finally, there's that last category where the rule of cool carries everything pretty much. And if you're feeling it at the time or something's cool at the time, you just might float faction to faction and just enjoy being caught up in the whole experience there too. And so for each one of these players, they're going to look at setting up their warband in kind of a different way. Initially, the historical guy wants to make something that matches what he believes is like the historical representation of this army. This is the pure historical player, which you don't get that a lot in Saga. And then there's the game mechanic guy too, who says, all right, I want mass activations. So how am I going to best maximize with my units mass activations? And then finally, the rule of cool guy at the end just says, like, what are the sweetest models possible? How can I make them work on the board in a way that makes me not lose every time? And we're going to go from there. And again, I think Saga has such a good atmosphere because everyone is honestly a mix of all three of those categories usually. We all like one thing or the other. But when you finally have used one of those metrics to try to decide, am I excited about the flavor of this faction? I'm just thrilled to buy these models. because for an example, for me in this case too, I've always, recently did Republican Romans, and I always wanted a reason to play those guys since mini games before Saga. And so I already had those models. I wanted to buy those, and as soon as I found out I could have an avenue to play them, I got everything together. I knew I wanted to play them at some point. Then the next phase comes. I have to look at the board, and I'm also that mechanics player. So it's instantly just signing on because the board was pretty, in my historical sense, cool models, flavor I love, drop it completely. Now we got to just focus on mechanics and board and really read into those abilities. And right off the bat, then we find out that with the Republican Roman board, you see that it's listed out this special condition, mana pools. And you notice that it focuses mostly on your warriors. And you look at your board and you kind of notice at least 4 or 5 of these abilities are built around either mana pools or the warriors. So from this little mix of information, right off the bat, you have a sensation. I got to have a lot of warriors, and not only that, but they have to meet the conditions that help me do well with my board. For the historical player, this is also in luck because all these things just kind of line up nicely with that board. The stuff that you wanted to take already works pretty well, and it comes and lines up from there. But a lot of other factions and a lot of different armies, sometimes the coolest models we find aren't always the best way to play the board. And that's often really cool Hearthguard models. Longtime players see warriors and levy carrying most of the load in a lot of games. And so we shy away from big Hearthguard builds, but if you're just looking at the sweetest models, the things that motivate you the most to want to paint them and look at them, it's going to be your Hearthguard. So you're probably going to amass Hearthguard over the time with your collections that you play the game. And finally, at some point, you'll probably want to play a whole Hearthguard army too. But so that's my framework a little bit. We didn't really talk rule of cool guy, but he's kind of the guy who has 6 points of Hearthguard just because he thinks those models rock. And Saga actually gives him a pretty decent platform to still probably make it work. But if you haven't looked at what your board provides for you, and you haven't looked at the framework, the kind of flow that's hidden in each one of the boards, you might be a little disappointed. You'll still be able to raw Saga yourself through a couple fun rounds, but ultimately looking at your board is going to be the best way to start. So,
well, I'll kick into what I do now, just on me, and not necessarily a general thing. I look at something I want to play, and it Saga. I'm not really tied to warbands in particular as far as the thing. So what I want to play is something I want to paint, and so if I don't like the way that that's going to paint up, or I don't want to paint that, then that's going to get kicked out. And then to add to what Luke said, I really want multi-activations in some place on that board, just for dice economy, and to make. And then the last thing I'm looking for in a board is I want a combined arms board, because I like to play that way. I want to be able to shoot, and I want a board that can also melee too. So one that's really dedicated to only doing one thing, I really don't like that much. But so I'm looking for something that'll do a lot of different things, and they're out there. But you just have to kind of wade through what you want. There's been some other games that I've played in the past that using those criteria, there were some armies I just didn't want to play. Like when I played Flames of War, my father landed on D-Day, and so I'd never played Germans. It was just kind of a little thing. They were fun to paint. I painted a couple of units for some guys, but as far as me wanting to play them, I just no, not going to do that. So I don't really have that problem in Saga, but the wanting to paint stuff really is really important to me.
Yeah, and that's where I guess I got into that. Like each one of you kind of got into that idea of like, more often than not, it's finding something that does play to your play style. So having things that do well, but it's also the idea of like, if you want to paint something, if you want to do and kind of making that almost a jump off point of, as you look through the boards, you're kind of finding multiple things of like, here's kind of my play style, here's the things I like. But also things that like you said, is I think, Stephen, you mentioned the idea of like running Romans. Charles, for you, kind of your idea of like painting things that historically just they look fun to paint, and but they also kind of fit those multiple roles. Yeah. And
I'll also throw in kind of an inverse, which is I tend to shy away from factions that have some sort of bespoke resource or mechanic. And by that, I mean, like, you got your board, the board's great, the way they function is already really interesting, and then there's something else. So, like, when I envision that, I'm thinking about Gauls specifically,
Rations.
Thracians, Iberians, and they've been doing it more lately. And it's like, I don't care how good that faction is or how much it would tickle me to run it. I don't want to remember another bespoke mechanic.
Yep.
And it's like it just pushes me straight away from them.
So the extra mechanic is definitely not your flavor.
It's a step too far. Like the
Yeah.
game's already doing this really fun resource economy. It's like,
Mhm.
here's another resource. Oh, come on.
Mhm. So Yam's Vikings aren't in your future anytime soon?
No, and like the only time I thought it was tolerable was in version 1. I played a lot of military orders, and it was like you could take a turn off. You remember this mechanic, Steve? So
Oh,
you
yeah.
take a turn off. You
Yeah,
take
you're
a turn
praying.
off. Yeah, you put a dice in, and it increases your prayer meter by 1. And then certain abilities get more powerful based on how many turns you put dice in this prayer box. So like that was an easy to keep track of bespoke mechanic, and then they just threw it out the window for version 2. It's like, well, now I'm back to not wanting to play any of these.
Well, it half sounds like impetus, I'll be honest. Like as now I've
And
played
that's
against Charles
kind of what it was
Romans.
like.
Yeah, see, I've played Romans now a whole bunch thanks to
It was
Charles.
piety in this case.
Yep. But
Yeah, they don't multi-activate, which is kind of very well at all, but they do have some real strengths, and so they make up for that in a couple other ways because they do a couple other things really really well, and they have a couple of tricks that are very unusual in the game, so which makes them fun to play and a little unexpected to your opponent.
There are definitely ways to win with boards that don't have multi-activations. You just have to,
Oh,
I think,
yeah. I'm
be very
looking at you.
clever and like especially clever about tempo.
And that's and even though I selected Republican Romans as the example, that isn't the type of board I shine to. That's only that's the historical nature in me that wants to play it. Same with setting up Thracians and stuff here too. But definitely getting the most bang for your buck, whether it's mass activations or where you feel that you can have very good trades, good dice economy. And in this case, we mean good dice on economy that maybe my board gives me 5 attack dice for a common, whereas this other board gets 5 attack dice for a common and an uncommon combined, but
yeah.
maybe they have just a tiny change to it or something like that. And you say these are good exchanges. And sometimes the love for history of a faction will supersede that and we'll get them together, but they're not usually who shows up at tournaments so much. And we'll talk about that later. But part of that, there is a kind of a wild card factor to those too, because you don't expect them as much. But that's a whole other topic for sure.
Well, one thing that I like to look for on a board too is most boards will have, they all have the same number of things, but most of the time you're only going to play 4 or 5 of those abilities in a game. I mean, the others will be really rare things that might or might ever show up. And I want 3 or 4 of those 4 or 5 things to be activated on commons. And if they aren't, then that becomes a really strong board.
Yep. And I was going to say some of that same thing too, that as you're looking at this board, sometimes you'll see, or right, almost every board has an ability that any dice can do pretty much, other than your top basic abilities.
Yeah.
And right off the bat, this isn't always the case, but you can really start to get a sense of the board based on those easy to access abilities, because they're kind of the intended direction that the board is supposed to take. If you can always be activating this ability, it's maybe something that even from a design function was thought of as being a really important part of this board or something else. And sometimes that's not the case. Again, like I said, I think there are a couple abilities out there that are activated on 3 dice or any of the dice that aren't that big a deal. But when you see a couple good ones, or like Charles said, where you see that every good ability that you want to get on this board takes either commons, uncommons, or like a combo of accepting both. It can take a common or an uncommon. And you see just a lot of those and say, oh boy, I can get a lot out of this. But then, since this is the topic of warband building rather than
Yeah.
selecting your board so much, I would comment that that puts you in kind of a situation to decide what you want to do. Do you want to concentrate your efforts on this mechanic that goes over and over again, funnel it all into one big unit in one big action? You know, Goths are notorious for players wanting to do
Yeah.
that. As soon as they see all those abilities, they just chain them right up and
Yep.
overkill the first unit they
Yeah. Yeah.
see,
Let me throw 32
and
dice
then
this
their
one
unit
little
gets
unit. Yep.
wiped or something.
Hmm.
But then on the same time, you say, huh, I need a lot of dice to do all the stuff I want. Do I instead want an army of lots of small units? And that's the conundrum of all players, kind of. Most
Hmm.
of us, though, are going to address the issue right off the bat of Saga dice generation. We all have kind of a lower cap that we can accept for Saga dice generation. In some armies, you can drop down pretty low in that. An example maybe are Indians and Carolingians. Both can kind of have low Saga dice boards with really big units because three of their dice, four, maybe five with the Indians if you're crazy, are committed to something
Hmm.
on the board that sticks there pretty much the whole game. So after turn two or so, you're already only going to be rolling five dice for the Carolingians or someone else in there. And
Hmm.
so you don't necessarily need to bloat up your list with units that are then hard to activate, even though both those armies have great mass activations.
Yeah, they do.
Beside the point, though,
Hmm.
and that's what you really have to decide next in your thing is
Hmm.
how does my structure and pick of my warband impact what I want to do with this board a lot. In you know, an easy one right off the bat, you know, is you look at Anglo-Saxons, right?
Hmm.
If we were just talking in a really generic way to somebody about Saga and building warbands, we'd commonly say maybe warriors are an excellent take. We should take almost
Yep.
as many warriors as you can in most
Hmm.
lists, and that they're going to be the workhorse of your army. But if you're and then you realize that this guy plays Anglo-Saxons, you say, wait, ignore everything I said. It's
Yep.
got to
Yep.
be levy for you
Hmm.
all day. And so when you start to examine those parts, it becomes important to make sure that not just your board, but you need to read that rule book section too, because that's where you're
Hmm.
going to find all those special nuances. And some people just glance at the army list, make their army, and then realize they've been playing an illegal list. Maybe you can only have
Yeah.
one of a certain type of unit, or maybe you're like in the case of the mana pools or something, your sizes are wrong. Uh, or you know, you look at something like the Greek board, and obviously, if you want to play Greeks, you do want to play phalanxes, not because of the board or anything else, but you wanted to play Greeks. You're going to play
Hmm.
phalanxes.
Yep.
But the board does not force you to. But if you don't, you're ruined.
Yeah.
Everything on that board pretty much needs phalanx. And so those are the types of things where sometimes there's building that is required, and then there's building for taste, and then somewhere it harmonizes to the way that you want to win
Hmm.
your games a little bit.
Yeah.
But we're at step one basically. So winning the
Yeah.
games at the end, we're deciding what models to buy on the gripping beast site or something, or
Yep.
foot source. So
And
or yeah.
then that jumps into, like, for me, this is where I think, as I've played with you guys who have a ton of experience, and the reality is, like, the first time I picked up a board and I said, okay, I want to run Vikings. Right. And I said, okay, well, here's kind of, when I look at the board, it kind of almost felt like that. Like, I'm looking at all of these abilities and I'm trying to imagine how do they play. And with really minimal experience, it was a really big load to, like, figure out of, like, do I run Levy? How do I run them? Am I going to shoot with them? Am I going to have warriors? I want to have Hearthguard because they look cool. But then you look at, like you said, is that ability. And that's where I often see people online asking, hey, is this list for, like we just talked about, right? For, like, Vikings, is two warriors, a bow levy, or two units of bow levy, a couple warriors, and a couple Hearthguard. Is that a good starting list? And I guess it goes back to some of the stuff you guys pointed out, is thinking about how do these abilities really interact with these units, and what are you trying to do? And take a good long look, because that's where I think, for me, honestly, sometimes I got into trouble and was not doing that. Right? It's like, just like you said, it's like I want to have some
Yeah,
fun, cool stuff, and then you realize, like, oh, I didn't optimize towards the build of really playing to what this like list wants me to do.
right. So I think like if if you're taking a unit that is not supported by the board in any way, you should reconsider it.
Mm-hmm.
And like when people take their bow levy in Vikings or whatever, it's like, cool, what abilities help them? None.
Yep.
It's like, so why isn't that just another point of warriors where the entire board helps them,
Yep. Yeah, unless there's a specific thing you're doing, which I think, Charles, you've often talked about this, the idea of like, well, bow levy still shoots 6 times.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Bow Levy.
Yep.
So they you can always activate it with your warlord or an uncommon, so it's 6 shots, and you can shoot it twice probably, and take 1 fatigue, and that's 12 shots. And so
Yep.
fatigue free, because the fatigue doesn't happen until after that second shot. So people have to respect it if you get it into a point where it's controlling part of the board. So I think there's always a place for Bow Levy. Now on the some boards, though, if they've got access to Jav Levy and they support that, then maybe you want to go that way.
Yep.
But having levy shooters is powerful.
Well, that's where I like the point, right? I think both points are really good here. Is like you said, Luke, is does the board support this? If it doesn't, are you still getting your mileage out of this, right? That idea that I'm still going to get 6 shots or maybe 12 shots, but if the board supports Jav Levy, why am I not taking Jav Levy in this case? Because they don't support the Bow Levy. And that sometimes I think for me in the very beginning was a hard puzzle piece to put together. It's like understanding fundamentally why am I doing this?
It's not always obvious either. Like Javelin Levy and Vikings are very good because of Thor. It's like you get your bonus, you hit your 6, now we're in business. And like that, there's nothing on that ability that just says use this on the Javelin Levy. Like you have to figure that all out for yourself.
Like it's on your 30 year dice are going to explode when you use Jav Levy and hit something with them. Welcome
and it's not even a.
Go ahead.
And it's not specific to the unit. It's not addendum like a lot of stuff's addendum now, where it'll just say phalanx only or mounted only or whatever, and that just makes it a lot less of a mental load for someone learning the board. But stuff like that is so nuanced.
And that's what you have to decide if you're playing when you're just picking factions in general. Then are you the new player? Are you what level of task do you want to take down? How much mental static basically can you handle while you're trying to play and still have a good time and still feel like you're able to try to compete a little bit too. And there are certain factions, kind of like Romans are a really great example of that, where there's math going on all the time. And there's math you forget about sometimes. And if you forget about it, dang it, you can't use your abilities very well, or you don't know if you should be trying to increase it or not. You're battling a secondary mechanic to the game. Those usually aren't good choices for new players or anything else. And same with some of the strongest armies that are usually Jav, Cav, and composite bow, like cavalry armies, basically. Those are excellent. And most people would say if they're not the best types of warbands in Saga, they're in the first sentence about talking about that competition. They're really good always, but they're also the most fragile and they're difficult to pilot. And so if you can, like I said, it's like a skateboard or something else like that. You're going fast and you spill out quick, but it's a complicated way to get your game done, especially with composite bow guys more than anyone else. You're trying to have a great understanding of movement and activations and timing. And those are things that you usually build up after lots and lots of reps. You're not just going to learn it right away. But sometimes you can just go head first in with it and still usually do okay in Saga. But that's part of your consideration.
Well,
and what your goals are. So
Steel Tomahawk gives you in the front of the army books a little guide to tell you how difficult these armies are to play, and to some extent those are fairly accurate. So that 1, 2, and 3 star list, if you've got a 3-star army, it's probably going to have to be played with combo moves, or you're stringing moves together, or having to think about how your offensive reaction is going to play when you get back over to the defense, and those maybe aren't quite as prevalent on the 1-star list. Like I think Anglo-Saxons, we've talked about them. That's a 1-star list.
It's a 1-star list.
On defense, they're a rock. You got 12 guys that close ranks. Okay, move this. But Huns are a 3-star list, and you have to really think about what's happening when it's the other guy's turn, because they're a hammer, but it's a glass hammer. So they can be broke down pretty easy.
Unfortunately, as I'm learning, trying to run a bunch of combo armies right now, this is Man, that's
You gotta
brutal.
skin
That's
your knee first. Yeah.
I don't know if I've skinned my knee. I think I've just fallen off the skateboard and rolled down a hill at this point, but
Yeah.
I've had some
We'll
bad
get
ones,
there.
but I'm okay. I say we're getting into it. So with a lot of this is where I guess I get into now kind of the nitty-gritty of, for you, once you've selected the warband, right? So we've kind of talked, and I think the idea, Charles, too, the idea of like that 1, 2, 3 star, it really does lead to that. Like, as simple as it seems, is like, as a new player, I pick up a 3 star board and I'm like, oh, it doesn't seem that hard. And then you realize like the combos don't seem intuitive. And I've said this personally a couple times. It's like I go from playing like 2D chess to now I'm playing 3D chess. And all of a sudden I have like extra levels and I have all these different things that I don't, they aren't intuitive, where like when we look at the Viking board, you at least know a couple of those abilities play really well together. And you, okay, I want a couple of these, Uller, Frigg, Thor, like kind of running a couple of them together. But then you get into like you said, the Hun board, and you're like, none of these seem to play well together. And you realize, oh, it's because you're doing them in phases.
Yeah.
So once you've selected your warband, how do you then start the process of assembling units? And this is where I go to like sizes of units, the composition, which I know we've already kind of started talking about. But this is where I often see, and I'll say this even for myself, this is where I feel like I really start to get tripped up, is I'm like, okay, do I run a 7-pack, a Jav Cav levy here, or Jav Cav here, or do I run like a 9-pack a levy in this unit? For you, once you finally kind of, okay, I like these mechanics, now I'm really trying to kind of go, okay, where am I going to start from when it comes to this?
Well, one of the things that was kind of building off that levy bow back and forth there too is that you have 6 points, in most normal Saga,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to put probably 4 or so points dedicated probably to achieving the main task of your board, whether that's combat, whether that's tricks, Jav, Cav, whichever. But then you always kind of have these 2 points left over that you should ask some questions about sometimes. One of them, this is an old adage from chess, is king safety. At the start of every round of chess, when they're drilling you and stuff like that, you must assess king safety before you do anything else. A lot of times that's going to be your warlord in that case. And
Mm-hmm.
so, how are you going to keep your warlord protected or not? Do you feel that you're able to use his equipment options like being mounted to stay away from combat and use bulks of your warriors or other stuff like that? But you know that lots of your army is going to go fight or break down or be committed at a certain point. And so that leaves these kind of 2 points left. Does one of those points go to king protection or not? And then does one other point potentially go to the things that your warband can't do very well? And sometimes you don't want to do that. Sometimes you want all your points on the same thing. Huns again are a great example of that. Everything needs to be synergizing with
Mm-hmm.
each other a little bit. But sometimes you want to say, man, I have no answer to shooting whatsoever. I've got no answer to very fast units or something like that. So even though my board does not support cavalry very well, is it worth me taking with one of my points a cavalry unit that can reach out and touch guys when I need them to complement maybe the biggest flaw inside of my warband or something? And sometimes the answer is a dead no. Nope, focus in on more of the thing that is good. But sometimes you do, especially when you're going into a tournament, maybe. And I know that's the later topic, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you do say, I need all these tools because even though in my dreams every Saga game is Clash of Warlords, it's not. And a lot of these scenarios are going to have some really unique challenges that aren't going to be solved by looking at what good aggressive combos you have on
Yeah.
your board. You say, I need to get across to the other side, or I need to be able to contest something quickly. Or I think there's going to be a lot of terrain that's going to be around, and that is either good for my army or it's bad for my army, and I need to figure that out. So
Mm-hmm.
again, starting at that kind of place, 4 points of your army are for getting your work done, whatever that work is for your army. Then two remaining points are often for answering those questions. Do I need to keep my warlord safe, or should these be specialty units of some type? That's your
Mm-hmm.
bow levy, or a shooting guy, or mounted guy, or mercenaries, which we talk about sometimes
Yep.
too. But those are the things to consider at that point. And then from there, which I'll give up the mic here in a sec too, is how to break your units into individual sizes, and we can talk about that down the
Yeah.
line here too.
To add on to that individual sizes, when I set up a warband, I want 7 dice, at minimum,
Mm-hmm.
which a 6-point list is probably not going to be more than that, but that keeps me. So then if you want to have big levy blocks, or excuse me, big warrior blocks, now you're kind of having to compensate or give something up someplace.
Yeah.
And I don't really like to have 4 warriors sitting in the back row someplace, because those absolutely are going to do nothing for me in the game. And if it gets down to where I need those 4 warriors, I've lost. So I don't like to have that type of a unit on the table. So if I have to have some small blocks of like 5 or 6 warriors or whatever, I would much prefer them to be composite bow or jav cav, because then they can do something. So like five composite bow warriors, especially if the board supports them a little bit, they can be an annoyance to somebody.
Yeah, they really can.
So 5-foot warriors setting back their generated Saga dice is just doing nothing, and they're not going to do anything. So you have to take that into consideration. So it does kind of limit or how big those warrior blocks are going to be. The levy blocks are going to be. Are you going to take them as 12, 11, 10, 9? The levy blocks, you can mess with the size of those too, to get out to that 7 dice frame.
Yeah.
I guess I'd say the only time I take really big chunky units is when the composition limits me to only having 1 of. So I've been fussing with Syracuse lately, and it's 1 of Hearthguard, 1 of Mounted Warriors. It's like, okay, cool. 8 Hearthguard and 12 Mounted Warriors every single time, because it's like the composition knows that those are just extremely useful in the context of the board. So like I'll make compromises other places, like smaller warrior units and support and stuff like that, just to have those 2 hammer units that are getting to use so much of the board and get so much out of the board.
I think those hammer units are a lot more effective when you have specific objectives that you have to control, especially on objective games where there's only 1 objective. And there are quite a few of those, because then the hammer unit can really focus on that one spot and become a real thorn for the opponent. When there's like 3 objectives, I tend to just, okay, they can have it. We'll go play someplace else. So
right.
Yeah.
It's like that capture the hill mission. It's like the Hearthguard take the hill on turn 2, and this is where they shall remain. It's like, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Then they become a real problem for the opponent.
Yeah, that's I guess where I think about stuff like that is the struggle of once I've decided what's going to go, why am I choosing a 5 pack of warriors, or kind of splitting? I think this is something we did talk on the 10 games for your warband, is trying some of this stuff out later. But understanding that, I like that point, right? Is that I like to have so many dice, and if I'm not going to have that many dice, why am I doing that, right? The idea of like, does the scenario call for it, right? If I need to go up here with a couple 12 packs of warriors, I'm going to lose a lot of dice to do that. But am I getting my return on that? And I think that's something you've talked to me about a lot, Stephen, is the idea of like getting return on my investment at that point of, like, why am I choosing this composition to do this? Or why am I going to take 2 4 packs of warriors to sit in corners to be dice generators? Because that's sometimes the hard part. Yeah, go ahead.
I often end up being in the smaller units category because, again, as I talked about at the start of this, one of my main goals a lot of times in choosing a warband is maximizing potential out of small events and stuff. And I talked about that with my with the Vikings over last year to Adepticon and other stuff like that, trying to take 6 warriors and make sure that every time those 6 warriors are removed, they've taken 8, 9, 10 warriors with them, or a unit of Hearthguard or some other thing like that. Always trying to get good returns on all my stuff. So as a result, I often have a lot of small units trying to get my biggest potential. But in Saga, sometimes that's a huge handicap too, because a lot of times with very small units, if you are massacre points, each one of those units you've lost completely, which should be pretty easy, is giving up an entire point to the enemy. Or even worse, in survival points, it's deducting it from a score that's already pretty small on a warband like that. And so it has some ups and downs, but most of the time you can make it work. And sometimes it can be, sometimes you'll see where a hammer unit of 8 Hearthguard or something else, and usually one accompanying unit, maybe in this case, Luke's Hearthguard and big 12-man block of warriors there. And then kind of the rest of the army sometimes is just a battery to power that unit, that combo pretty much. And some warbands can get away with that. And in those cases, that's where you do see the little 4-man packs in the back or 5-man packs in the back, because that player is recognizing from the beginning that they say, like, if I'm using these guys, I already have lost everything. Every bit of my economy is going into this unit, and my warlord. And I hope that by the time they're not a factor anymore, it's turn 5, and when the dust settles, there's not much left. And you kind of go from there too. And that does work pretty well. But Numidians are a great example then on the other side. In a board that the mechanics really drew me to more than anything else, even though the Numidians as material culture and stuff like that aren't as interesting to me. It's an excellent Jav-Cav board, but it has some big orders that you see as soon as you look at that board. And one of them says that for all of your units that shoot 4 times or less, for the rest of the turn, they get +1 extra shot every time. And so, you know, as you build up your units, well, heck, to get the most of that, I should make sure all of my shooting units are 8 models or less. And then you have an epiphany too that, hey, a 6-man unit of warriors now shoots the same as an 8-man unit used to. And that's where you start to make realizations about your numbers of guys sometimes. You say, I can run lots of these small guys and still be full combat effective when it comes to my offense and shooting and other stuff like that. But even with Numidians who really, really exceed, I end up taking, 1 point with the elephant or something else, because I have to say, what can my army not do? I have cavalry supremacy when I have Numidians, but I can't go in terrain very well. I can't deal with infantry very well. I need a fixed position to move my cavalry behind a lot of times. And so that's going to help in my selection too. That's kind of picking that thing that is a deficit for you. And honestly, the board doesn't really jive a ton with the elephant. There's some, well, actually, I forgot about the buffed version of the board now, so never mind. It rocks.
The buff version of the board is terrifying.
It's really good. So so anyway, yeah.
So another thing you look for when you want to take a lot of small units is how those units activate. And so do they activate and give you dice when they activate? And that can be really important. So if your little 6-man unit can activate with 2 dice, it's going to act. You've got a base of 8. If you can add more dice on from someplace else, and so you have other cheap ways to get bonus dice. And so your 6-man unit could potentially be hitting with 16 dice if you've got the right. I mean, probably not going to happen too often, but still, you can buff them up really easy to that thing hits pretty hard. And so nothing more fun than taking 6 warriors into 6 Hearthguard and having the same number of dice in that fight. So even when you lose, you're probably going to win.
I will say this is I got to run Vikings after not playing them for a long time this last weekend. Game didn't go the way I wanted, but man, I forgot how much fun, like just putting them in 6-packs and just flying them across the board. It also gets back to that sense of like, it was a really fun, it played to the list really well. It made Vikings just dangerous. But it was also really fun. I'll say that to kind of get back to maybe something. I know we spent a lot of time talking about competitive, but man, that was probably one of the funnest games of Saga I've played in a while. It was just like, you have all these 6-packs of warriors sitting there with a Viking board supporting them. And like somebody else across the board's like, I do not want to get into melee with a single one of those units. But
fun rules sometimes, man. That's for sure. That's the
it
draws you in some.
So I guess kind of jumping into the next thing, just kind of at this point, is kind of the big question, I think, as we've now talked about selecting your warbands and your sizes, your compositions, thinking about right? Like you said, is that there's this core of I want to do what the board does, then kind of add what am I missing? What is this board missing? Can I support that, or do I just need to lean into this other aspect of like if it just kind of shoots really well, do I just kind of really lean into that? But the next question for me is when looking to add a mercenary unit, right? This is to me the kind of the big game changer of everything we've now talked about. When looking to add a mercenary unit, what are you looking for as you hope to incorporate them into your warband?
Well, I'll say two things. One, does it have determination? So it can activate itself.
Yeah.
Which is a big thing to me. And the other thing is to do something that really helps my warband. I'm playing in the online league. I have Roman guides, and they really have a huge bonus for my Romans, because they really help me control the way the battlefield looks, which is important to make the list work. Now they don't have determination, but they do several other things really, really well.
Yeah.
So one of those two things, and then they have to aesthetically, to me, fit into the warband a little bit. So they look right on the table. It's not like, like I think some people that I've played with, like sailors. To me, I don't see where they ever fit in any warband, so I'll never run them.
I say we could, yeah, that's a whole different topic, but that's
yeah.
That's exactly, Charles nailed it basically. Does it activate by itself? Because that's a huge bonus. So many of the mercenaries are incredibly strong, maybe way too strong in some cases. We all kind of know that they are. Some not as strong as others, but obviously, guys, Gale Hill and some of these others out here, we know that they are very good. And it's not just their crazy stat block. The old camel riders, obviously, are a great example there too, where it just seems like they have ability after ability after ability after ability. But that's not even what makes you want to take them a lot of times. It's you guys have guys with determination. We're in, because then you have a unit of your army that has great output, even if it's just for one turn or something like that. And you can take all 6 of your other dice and focus it on the rest of your army. And it makes it easy to have an individual operating element that just rocks pretty much. But there are other times where you do want to consider it. The guides are a great example, because I don't remember if they have determination.
They don't.
They don't, but they're just so good anyway, because in that case, the guides either move terrain, delete terrain, add terrain. That's game changing sometimes. So at that point, you don't really care about determination. You care about a massive advantage on picking your field a little bit. But there are other times, a priest would maybe be a good example too. Obviously, priests do well in almost all war bands if you really want to take it. But most of the time, you're using a priest to give yourself a rare. And there's not always boards that need rares, pretty much. Honestly, going back to Numidians earlier, they don't really need or want rares most of the time. They want a whole bunch of other dice. And even though there's no priests in the antiquity boards, just as an example, they would be a board that doesn't care very much about a unit that helps them guarantee a 6. But the Anglo-Saxons, on the other hand, think that that's amazing to be able to generate a 6 and make my whole fleet of levy into warriors basically turn after turn after turn, guaranteed for at least 3 or 4 turns. That's humongous. So those are big. Or the other favorite for the Anglo-Saxons there, and this goes back to my other thing that I like when I'm picking a mercenary unit, is does my board interact with them in some kind of way? People that are reading mercenary rules really quickly will often think that Saga abilities don't interact with the mercenaries at all, but really there's just kind of a set of restrictions. A lot of orders are going to be able to take advantage of them. Some other things that don't directly ever activate the unit. There's a lot of times where that matters. And a good example is the Anglo-Saxons there using the fanatic pilgrims, another favorite, the angry monks in that case. It's so excellent. The board wants large units, and they're able to benefit from some of the things on there. They're able to boost their size and count for certain things. They can, I don't remember if truce removes fatigue. It just removes fatigue. It's not
It
a
does.
rest, right?
Yep, it
Yeah,
removes
it just
fatigue from
removes
everybody
fatigue.
that's over like a 10 man or
And
12.
so those,
Yep.
Yeah.
yeah, those pilgrims are a great example of being able to remove one of their fatigues by taking advantage of truce because they're not resting and stuff. Or another example is to the Goths, who usually don't need mercenaries too much because they're a pretty rocket board. But I think that the steppe nomads are interesting on that board because you can use their order, the feud or feda, I don't remember what they call it in this edition, but you mark a unit, and for the rest of the turn, all your units get +1 extra attack and shooting, +2 in combat. But you can decide if you're having a really bad dice board that all you got was commons and you're not going to get your combo, you can mark that unit with an order, take your mercenary unit, gallivant them out there, and probably get 20 shots off before they figure out how to burn your fatigue or something else like that to slow you down. And that's another great example. We're using in orders to make a flexible tactical mercenary turn into an offensive mercenary because of what we did. And so that's what I like. Board interaction, does it activate itself is the immediate one you draw into. But Thracitai are popular in antiquity, and they don't have a way to activate themselves. And I've kind of started to shy away from them the more games I've used with them, because it's been annoying to need to use a dice to move them up. They can't take advantage of my mass activations or anything else like that. So
I don't run mercenaries terribly often just because this is just a like what kind of player are you, but like I enjoy the interactions on the board so much that to have units with restrictions against them is just frustrating. But what I do like are our old friend the personal champion, and he shows up in a couple different books, and it's just like, does he have determination? Yeah, he does. Can he also use the board? Yep. And like if I'm going to buy a mercenary, he's almost always the one I'm going to reach for. And like just the restriction of having to keep him close to the warlord is not a problem because they form a little tag team buddy duo.
Yeah, they do.
They go and beat people up, and it's awesome. So it's like that's just another thing where it's like, what's your board doing? Is it like I'm usually running personal champion at like Saxons or Scots or something. It's where I'm forcing these tough units up the field, and also just like getting his 3 aggression shooting shots off on reach is really helpful too. It's just like not a play you see terribly often.
Yep. Well, and I like that point, right? Is that it doesn't have to be cover. It's just that ability of like it just fits in really well. I think we didn't touch on it too much, but like the idea of like loyal, right? Are they a loyal unit? Which there's not a ton.
No, they're like 2.
Yeah. But
or certain boards sometimes will open it up.
Yeah. I mean, like the Anglo-Saxons and the Pilgrims is such a wild, like at first, I guess it didn't seem intuitive to me as I started playing the Anglo-Saxons, and you realize like, no, they activate super easy. They get all the orders that this board does. This board is like an orders board. And so they kind of like,
I mean, if you've got a lot of access to orders, then your mercenaries are going to fly.
Yeah, the best example of interacting with the board is probably the Levantine Crusaders. With the I can't remember if they're angry monks or the
fanatic pilgrims.
Fanatic pilgrims, because they use the board. They're just another unit, and they get the whole thing. So it's really a nice addition to that board.
I'll say that sometimes though, like we were talking about with regular, you got 4 points to do your battle. You got 1 point maybe going to help your warlord. Then there's that mercenary point, and sometimes you're also still trying to achieve that goal of being good at something that maybe your board isn't great at, or trying to just help the other 4 points of your board accompany what's going. And a good example of that, I think, is with the Franks board in Invasion. The Franks want to pull in orders, and they want their warband to win successive melees as much as they can. And they don't have access to fast units. They got some good fatigue plays and multiple charges and stuff. But I think that the Federati then is a great unit for them a lot of times, because it's a mounted unit that if it wins the fight, immediately starts another fight right after it. And so it helps to build up that pool for the Franks. And at the same time, give them the ability to have pretty much a 24-inch threat range of a pretty meaty unit that you can, at least on one turn, make a big show with and stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas otherwise, the foot slogging Franks kind of need to plod up on their first couple turns before they get it. Federati can maybe start the game off on turn 2 with a really significant charge on a lightly armed unit. And then now you've built up that board's core mechanic with their momentum. I think it is the momentum counters on there, and then everything starts to synergize a little bit there too. So
yeah, well, I like that idea too. Like you mentioned, like it also kind of takes tempo, right? The idea that this mercenary is going to allow my foot sloggers, you're gonna have to divert attention, so we can get into this. I think about our game a long time ago, Charles, with the it was the Romans versus the Anglo-Saxons. And I had to deal with what it was Gale Gadel. I can't remember. No, it wasn't Gale Gadel. It was they're not in that book. I can't remember which mercenary unit used. Now, top of my head, it was Vagrant Warriors. I think is what it was.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it was like that unit that I was like, okay, I kind of know I got to get up here quick, but I have to deal with these guys because they were kind of holding the initial charge, and so for me being on the other side of that, I had to kind of almost rethink. Okay, I know what the Romans do. I faced you a couple times, and all of a sudden these guys are on the board. I've got to account for them. And I've got to kind of almost change the way I come up to you. And so I always kind of like that idea that I had to deal with them in some way, shape, or form. So it kind of go ahead.
Yeah, but one thing you have to remember when you take mercenary units too is that they are worth more points for massacre points for your opponent than the other units that you can take. And so you may not want to get them wiped out, because that's just giving your opponent a couple extra points.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to be able to use them. And if I'm going to lose them, I want them to really be taking some stuff with them, So
and they should, like with all the extra rules they come equipped with. Like if you're just walking them out there to get shot to death by bow levy, you've done it all wrong.
Yep. So
survival point game though. Throw your mercenaries out there. They're worth half points on that. Get those boys out there.
They're the first to die.
They're
the first to die.
If you somehow are going to an event and it's 3 rounds of survival points, then go berserk. That'd be a sad event.
Let's don't go to that.
Draw.
So that's kind of, I guess, switching gears. The last point I want to talk about, and this is, I think, is we're all kind of in Adepticon swing. I know one of the guys here locally is kind of getting ready for like Winter. We're thinking about our own stuff here locally. Is there a difference for you when building for an event? So this is where I think of a starting point for a warband, right? I know I want to take this warband. This is maybe why I want to do it if I don't have a lot of experience with them. But I want to take this warband and go be really competitive with them. So I know what we've kind of talked about does lead into that conversation, but is there a difference for you guys when I think about that? Is that we're all kind of building towards a big event, or a couple big events coming up? Is there a difference?
Well, definitely.
Definitely. The first thing I do, and I'm like going to Adepticon, is I'm reading the scenarios right now and thinking about. I know what I kind of like to take. But right now I'm going through the scenarios and thinking about how the composition of how I want to play that warband is going to work in that scenario. And if I don't think it's going to work, then we'll be moving on to another warband or seeing if I can change the composition of that one a little bit to accomplish what needs to happen in that scenario. Because all warbands aren't going to be equal in every scenario. So that's important. And in a place like Adepticon, where we're going to be playing 4 different armies in 4 different days, through 4 tournaments, it's a lot to get ready for. But I think if you don't do that, then you're just kind of setting yourself up to be handicapped when the game starts.
Definitely. Well, and there's a great difference between even just my own tenacity, anyways, that's for sure, at playing at home compared to playing abroad. But you can see it over the last couple leagues in this case too. Franks and Republican Romans, they're not terrible boards or anything like that, but with some exceptions recently, they're not usually the top boards. They're good, even keel boards.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get blown out of the water. You're not going to inherently smash the enemy if your whole combo lands. Uh, but at home, I've picked those guys out during the season because it gives me an opportunity to play a couple armies that I just think are fun, and I don't really have any ambitions with them. I just maybe think that their interactions are really cool. Franks are a great example. But at most tournaments, you have to account for squaring up against the best warbands. And there is a meta for Saga for sure. There's, probably 10 boards that everyone, if you asked everybody to write down who they think the top 10 boards are out of all of Saga, probably 7 of them would show up on everybody's list or something like that, or at least a couple key figures. Welsh are always going to show up. And I talk about for a Viking tournament, if you're coming into play, if you don't have an answer for the Welsh, then you need to start thinking about some stuff. You need to think about, well, and this really depends on what your ambitions for the tournament are.
Yeah.
Most people, when they play a tournament, want to win, but genuinely, because the community is not massive, some people just play the tournament because the game is damn fun. They like the people that are there, and that's cool. And we're going to float through it. And they're also, if their dice go well enough, they might still be at the top tables because that's just how a Saga goes. So, but you're gonna likely, especially if it's a multi-day tournament or something, a 6-game tournament or something, at those top tables, you're gonna see the big boys that you were afraid of the whole time. In Vikings, you're gonna see Scots, you're gonna see Welsh, you're gonna see maybe Anglo-Saxons and a Carolingian shooting list or something. Those are the top 4 guys that if you don't have good answers for those, or you don't have an answer for the Irish list or something, you really have to start building your warband a certain way. I can give a good example for what I'm doing right now, even though the current round of Adepticon, some people may know, is heavily punishing shooting. And so that's something that really changes a lot of the war bands in Saga and a lot of the balance between those war bands. Normally, I say that if you don't have a plan for a lot of shooting, your warband can't deal with it. It's maybe not the one to pick. And it's why Anglo-Saxons are so forgiving on their first run out, because even if you play the best shooting warbands, shooting off 72 bodies is you're gonna better be rolling hit and kill on every single dice, the whole game or something like that. But you have to have answers for those type of things. So antiquity tournament, I'm taking successors, but the Persians and the Indians are the shooting masters of Saga pretty much. And the Indians are something of a soft spot of mine, and I've done well with them in the past. And so I know that I must take care of those light chariots. And as I sit there with my very cool successor army, I realize there's nothing to go take care of these guys in my current build. And so I tool it around until eventually I have a couple small light cavalry units that I can use to take care of that. And I start to rep those units in my build, even when I don't think that those units are necessarily the right choice for my opponent at the time, but just so I can start to get familiarity and put myself in weird positions with those units so that I can try to maximize when I do get stressed and go up against the wall at a tournament. Because, plans don't survive first contact, all that sort of stuff. You have to be able to have a good plan beforehand, but also in the heat of the moment, have enough reps in or understanding of your units to be able to make your decision without freezing up and choosing the wrong thing there too. And that's what's really hard when it comes to warband composition specifically, especially with a unit or army like successors like I'm taking. Because in my case, I'm taking all warriors, but those warriors can be of pretty much every unit type that exists in Saga inside of those. So trying to decide what I want to take through an entire tournament versus what things I want to keep built and in my box with me to be able to cycle out when I play, it seems like a good idea to show up with every single option every single time if you have the ability to. But if you make last minute drastic changes to your warband at deployment time, there's a good chance you're going to be on awkward footing as soon as you start to get out of position of your perfect combo or the placement that you wanted on the board. And you have to try to prepare for that some way.
Well,
so yeah, that's what I think about prepping your list ahead of time a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think because Saga using warriors and to some extent levy, well, and Hearthguard too for that matter, allow you choices within the line. You could be Jav warriors, Sarissa warriors, or just regular plain Joes, and it might matter to you what your opponent is and what they have, uh, uh, and it can be really important. I played a practice game the other day. And I played the Normans, who I think will probably show up at Fimbulwinter against the player who is here, Stephen, who's going to go with Dwea, and so I had a whole bunch of mounted Normans because I didn't bring any dismounted stuff. And I just got blown off the board, by the Mutawea. And I was as an example, if I were in a tournament and I wanted to play Normans, knowing that some of this stuff could be there, and some of the scenarios really don't look like I would want to be mounted in them anyway, even though Normans don't support foot very well. I would still want to be able to dismount that cavalry and play it that way, because it would do a lot better in under those circumstances. And so as I make my list up, I look, okay, if I'm playing the Romans, for instance, or if I'm playing the Indians, I probably maybe I'm going to have a little bit of difference in the way I want this list to look when I put it on the table. And as we look at it, we're going to look and see what's probably going to be there, or what type of army may I have to face.
Yeah.
And like Stephen pointed out, if I'm playing the Indians, I have to be able to go touch those chariots. So I've got to have something that can do that. If I'm playing the Romans, I'm not worried so much about being fast because they aren't, but I've got to be able to stand and take it, So it's can I adjust the list to do that, So that's important to me as I make up the list.
Yeah. Well, that's.
And as
I think
Charles,
it's also.
oh, go ahead, Luke.
Yeah. I think it's also important to be playing something you're extremely familiar with, so you're taking like mental load off yourself. Like, bring something where you know the combos pretty intuitively, so that instead of fussing around with like how your dice economy is going to work and all this kind of stuff, like, no, I'm focused on the opponent. Like that's where all my intellectual resources are going, because I already know how to do this. This works just fine, and I can do it like with my eyes closed.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think that's generally where I go to in terms of like what am I going to bring to a tournament? It's going to be something where I don't have to think terribly hard about it to make it function, so I can instead kind of think about counterplay.
Yeah.
There are, as Charles started out with too, is the scenarios matter almost more than anything sometimes. And sometimes you might find that by sheer bad luck, you're going to end up playing a scenario that is not very Saga-like at all. And by that, I mean that we often play Saga for the love of the mechanics of the games and board, but maybe for this scenario, just a completely made up one. We have to go into within M of all of the corners of the board and hold those spots or something.
Yeah.
And so you say, okay, this is a fake game, right? We're not even like, we're just lining these guys up. No scenario like that exists, but there are several times when you say like, man, my army is like the most menacing melee machine that has ever existed. But the only thing I need to care about in this scenario is going forward, grabbing that thing and getting the heck out of there and leaving and not fighting the entire time. And so you need to build in a way that prepares yourself for that. I think it was maybe last Fimbulwinter, Charles had the Lady in the Lake scenario with the marsh in the center. I think that's right. Or maybe that was one of the other northern ones.
That was at Fimbulwinter. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you're looking at mercenaries, right? And vagrant warriors leap out at you because this is a unit that gets better the more fatigue it has, pretty much. And the main objective that everybody wants to fight over is stuck in the center of a dangerous piece of terrain. Now, that's not going to happen in most Saga games. Normally, there's even rules a lot of times in some things about not being able to place objectives in dangerous terrain, so you don't ever consider it. But if you're going for a 3-game event and you know that 1/3 of those events require you to be fighting in a marsh the entire time, and your whole army is light cavalry, well, maybe the Vagrant Warriors looks really, really awesome. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe you do build a type of way so that you can get off those horses and maybe try to fight in that marsh or something
Okay.
too. Or
Yeah.
you might say, man, I should not be taking a light cavalry army to this event because one of the other rounds also requires us to be in
Yeah.
terrain the entire time. Uh, if it wasn't for all the scenarios, light cavalry really would rule everything pretty much. The scenarios are kind of there to keep them back and
Yeah. Kind
say
of keeps him honest at that
terrain
point. Yeah.
here, terrain here, terrain here.
Mm-hmm.
But
Oh,
another great example is Ambush that a lot of us will be playing coming up here soon too.
Mm-hmm.
Ambush is a game that you might not ever once fight with the other guy and still be able to win the game.
yeah.
You got to break open the bags. You got to get the points from the bags, hold the objectives. This is kind of a modified version of Ambush.
Mm-hmm.
You could potentially not engage with the other guy the whole time. You want to, because that's why you painted all these guys with swords and
Yeah.
axes. You want to go hit guys. And I'm not going to not fight most of the time, but sometimes you just want to get out of there and focus on your objective completely. And it does mean sometimes that, you know what, hey, maybe I shouldn't bring this warband. Again, a lot of us had dreamt about all of Kansas City showing up with Huns and stuff like that for
Mm-hmm.
KC Cognate and all this type of
Yep.
thing sometimes. But in a tournament where shooting is severely penalized most of the time, Huns can get the job done. But maybe not everybody should take all come with Huns. Maybe we should pick
Yeah.
some better warbands or
Yeah.
something like that. I still might be taking them because I
Yep.
think they rock in melee. But what I really have to stare at the entire time is, can these Huns do well getting those bags? Can I get those
Mm-hmm.
bags? Can I go fight in terrain? There's a lot of that in this round at Adepticon.
Yep.
And Huns don't really want to go do that stuff. A good
Mm-hmm.
player is always going to make it work.
Yep.
But do you, like Luke was talking about, do you want to be operating at your highest strategic challenge the entire time? Because as soon as you have a dice slip up or something, you're gonna blow your top and you say, I can't handle it anymore. I'm going on all cylinders. Or do you want to play in a really comfortable spot and have a game plan ahead of time?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to bring Vagrant Warriors? Do you want to get in that marsh? Those are the other things to consider the most. That maybe scenarios sometimes matter more than anything if the main goal for you is winning your tournament. But if it's not, if the main goal is for you to want to take your warband that you really love and do as good as you can at that tournament, then you still need to be making these considerations the whole time. What things may you have to give up? And try to practice it before you show up at the event. Because if your idea is to have like 2 units of foot levy, get everything done for the Huns, but you've only run it once or something like that, you're
Yeah.
going to be tripping over your own feet when you try to play them. So those are big things to consider.
And I'll say this again. I know we're kind of getting to this point. We're just a little over an hour, but I just want to kind of give a chance for any last thoughts when it comes to all the different stuff we've talked about. When you think about building a warband or starting with a new warband, are there any kind of last piece of advice that either helped you along the way or just kind of any last
Well,
piece of advice?
I think you always want to look at your play style. Do I really want to be aggressive, or do I want to counterattack, or do I want to just sit back and defend? And those 3 different ways to play the game. And I think a player has to recognize what they're best at, and then what they're second best at, and what their weakness is. And once you identify that, then you can look for war bands that accentuate that.
And I'd also say, ask your friends, like reach out to your community. It's like, hey, I've been thinking about doing this, that, and the other. It's like, what are the problems that trip people up?
Mm-hmm.
And like we were talking about with like the sneaky synergy of javelin in infantry and
Mm-hmm.
Vikings, like that's the kind of stuff you're not going to notice as a beginning player. You're going to have to ask somebody and have that information kind of given to you, because you're just not going to figure it out on your own most of the time. So like surround yourself with smart players who can kind of point you in the right direction, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, one other thing to add in there, and I can't believe this wasn't like the first thing to talk about. If this podcast is about numbers of units and other stuff like that, odd numbered shooters. I can't believe we didn't talk odd
I
number
was
shooters.
I was trying to get there, but at the end of the day,
Yeah, odd
we're
number
gonna
shooters.
we're gonna do an episode on shooting anyways, so it's gonna come up. But go ahead, I say we're
But
gonna.
that's
Yep.
the thing. Saga is
Yep.
a game that rounds up for
Hmm.
getting in. So if you got 9 guys, they shoot like they're 10. If you got 7 guys, it shoots like they're 8. And
Hmm.
so I love 9-man units a lot of times. That's probably my favorite shooting build. But if you're going to be splitting stuff up into smaller units, consider, you don't always have to, but consider uneven numbers of units. It looks a little
Yeah.
weird, but it's a skirmish game after all. But if you have lots and lots of shooters, getting that extra little shot sometimes
Hmm.
is nice, especially when you have something like Numidians, where you're having tons and tons and tons of you might have 7 units shoot in one turn on a Numidian board. And if each one of those guys kind of rounded up to their advantage each time, that's 7 extra dice that just showed up
Yep.
for free
Yep.
inside of this round of shooting too. And so round up with your shooters or whatever. I still don't always do it just because sometimes, like the Romans and some other guys, sometimes I look down and the asymmetry irritates me, and I say, "Nope, I'm taking it on the chin today. We're not going to do it."
Yeah, we're not gonna do
Uh,
5s and 7s all across the board. We're gonna do 6s and yeah.
but ultimately, picking
It's
your warband is something that's really hard and it's overwhelming. One of
Hmm.
the things that we've talked about before too is sometimes picking a warband that you can, or figures anyways, that you can play as multiple warbands is a real big consideration. And it's a lot easier in the Viking Age. It's a little
Hmm.
harder in the Crusades age, and it's a lot harder in antiquity. But most players aren't going to care so much. We
Yeah.
go do that to death in the history episode and stuff
Yep.
like that.
Yep.
But in general, you get a lot of mileage out of a warband if you buy one whole army of round shield and spear guys, the infamous Dark Age warrior plastic
Hmm.
kit from Gripping Peace there,
Love it. Love
you're
it.
going to be able to make a ton of different armies and stuff. But you do need to know what you want a little bit. Or you at the very least need to know what you don't want. And sometimes you're doing melee army after melee army when you're starting the game, and so a lot of players then start to branch and they say, I want something that's not go smash head, I want something more complex.
Hmm.
Or a lot of us players have been doing a complex army for a while, and you say, I just want to smash heads, I just want to hit, I don't want to think about it anymore, I don't want any clever plays, I just want to load up and bang on them for a while. And
Yeah.
so you might find that you have different warbands for different moods in that case, and that you're kind of sliding back and forth between those. But if you are playing Saga, you likely like history, and I'll end it the same way that I started it, that you often are going to fall in love with some historical faction or just some little helmet you saw on a Pinterest or something else like that. Allow your curiosity to branch out from there a little bit. Find a cool new army because of that. Maybe you just saw some cool models and you don't even know what warband they're going to work for, but it might motivate you. Always run with it, pretty much. Whether you liked the ability or not, always try to run with it. And a lot of times you'll find a lot of great satisfaction in Saga, even if the warband that you picked out for yourself doesn't rock. If anything, it's going to influence your choices later on, and you're surely going to find another time to break out those models that you bought for your last round, pretty much
Yeah.
too. Find those cool mechanics, find the things that make you happy. And like Luke said, sometimes you might need to ask a little bit. Sometimes you don't know that you really, really liked using trap on Numidian board over and over and over and over again. But once you see it and you say, oh, I'd like to play that about 30 times or something like
Yeah.
that, you get that spark, run with it. Because I avoided Numidians for a long time just because I didn't want to paint pretty drab horses for, my entire army, my like 6th cavalry army or something like that. But I should have just jumped
Mhm.
on them when I originally saw them. It's too fun. I don't regret it. And just follow your heart.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you guys for being here today. Thanks for kind of walking me through or walking us through kind of the ways to start thinking about where's the starting point. That'll kind of close us out. So thank you guys for being here.
of course.
Anytime.
Yeah. Yeah, anytime, Brett. Thank you for running the podcast.
Yeah.